Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the museum. This is our special program with Westport author Michaela MacColl. My name, as always, is Nicole Carpenter. I am the Programs and Collections Director here at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. We are very pleased to start our program, as we start every program, with an acknowledgement and the recognition of the Paugussett people, who are the indigenous communities native to this region. We would also recognize that the Westport Museum and the town of Westport were built on and with unceded indigenous homelands. Tonight, we are pleased to offer this program as a free event online. If you would like to support the museum with a monetary donation, we do have our donation link here. This helps us promote all of these online events, and it presents to all of you, of course. If you are enjoying our programs and you'd like to be notified in the future, you can follow and like us on Facebook or Twitter at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. And if you've missed one of our live programs, you can always go back and watch a recording on either Facebook or on YouTube just by searching the name of that program and the Westport Museum. During our program, you are, of course, encouraged to ask and add your own questions, comments, or anecdotes. Just comment in the comment or chat box, and I or my speaker, as well as our discussion leader, will answer as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. At this point, I am going to turn it over to Ramin Ganeshram, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I really appreciate it, and welcome everybody. My name is Ramin Ganeshram. I'm the Executive Director of the Westport Museum of History and Culture. I'm so pleased this evening to have with me tonight Michaela MacColl, who is not only a Westporter and a New York Times bestselling author, but I'm proud to call her my friend. And a wonderful, wonderful writer of historical fiction. Michaela MacColl grew up in upstate New York, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that later as it relates to the story she's going to tell us. She studied Russian and Soviet history at Vassar College and at Yale University. Michaela lived in the south of France for several years before she settled in Connecticut with her family. Her first book, Prisoners in the Palace, was published in 2010, and her new book, just out now, The View from Pagoda Hill, is her 10th novel, and it's the first about her own family, although fictionalized a bit. She has 2 daughters and 4 enormously huge black cats, which I have had the privilege to see, and who are very hard to tell apart, the cats, not the daughters. And I'm very pleased to welcome her here this evening to be with us. Welcome, Michaela.
Oh, hi, Ramin. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure, as always, as you know.
Well, I feel like I'm coming home.
Well, you are. You're a friend to the museum for over a decade, right?
Yes.
Many years.
I was on board for a long time.
Long time. So, Michaela, I want our readers to know. So, first of all, this book is for younger audiences, right? Most of your work is for, would you call it middle grade, this book, or young adult, or older middle grade?
It's squarely middle grade, but I tend not to pull my punches with vocabulary or concepts. I tend to write for the 10-year-old that I was. So right. That's where I tend to land. I don't worry about the language being too sophisticated, because if I've written it properly, they should understand what I'm trying to say, even if the word isn't familiar.
Right.
But I do pull my punches a little bit in terms of anything that's graphic or violent. I like to keep that off stage a bit so right. that kids read what they're ready to read. I think right now, a lot of books, just because kids can read, that doesn't mean they necessarily should.
Right. That's well said. Yeah. Well, this book, however, is, it's so engaging. It's so entertaining that, I think adults would really enjoy it. I think adults would learn so much from it. I kind of sat up half of the night reading this book because it was just so really engaging to me. And then I finally said, I have to go to bed. I can't.
Oh, I'm very flattered. Thank you.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. So I would love it if you told everybody a bit about, tell us what the book is about, because really this is a book that is based on a true story from your own family. So if you could tell us what the book is about, and in that weave in, the true story that you're really writing about here.
Yeah, I really love to write from biography. Most of my novels have been based on real people, and then I go to town. I have the fictional mystery or a murder. It's really fun. This was a book where the biography I was working on was a little anecdotal. It was a family story. We didn't have a ton of documentation, but it was a family that was very near to, especially my mom and to me, about my great-great-grandmother. She was born 100 years before I was, in 1866. And she was born in Shanghai. Her father was an American engineer from Troy, New York. He worked for a company called Osgood Manufacturing that built dredge machinery. And they disassembled the dredge, put it on a ship that took 4 to 6 months to get to China. And then they reassembled it on the back of a Chinese junk. And it was meant to, it would scoop out the silt that had accumulated in canals around Shanghai. If you want to go a little further and think about what it meant that you needed to have deeper draft for these canal boats, it meant that Western boats were going into the interior of China, which takes you to a whole different political part. But for me, the story was my great-great-grandfather went to China, and while he was there, he met a woman. We don't know much about her, but we have her picture. Her name was Sun, and they had a daughter. And the next thing we know is the daughter shows up in upstate New York. She's, in real life, she looks like she's about 6, but I aged her up because for middle grade, kids who are 10 don't like reading about kids who are 6. And you can get a girl into a lot more trouble if she's 10, 11, 12 than you can if she's 6. Mm-hmm. So that's where I made that decision right off the bat. And that's what makes it historical fiction versus just history. I get to make choices that help my story. I have to explain it in the author's note, which I do, but the real story, she's 6 years old, ends up in upstate New York in a little town called Baldwinsville. Now, Baldwinsville is still a tiny town. It's outside of Syracuse. In the 1870s, it was the home to a lot of different kind of manufacturing because there was a river and the Erie Canal passed through. But really, it's a slow upstate New York town. And she ended up living with her grandparents, and the father he went back to China, he went all over the world working and abandoned her there. So the crux of the story was thinking about what did her grandparents think of this half Chinese granddaughter? And I wondered how much they'd known about her before she arrived. And the only other thing we know is that at some point, they had a huge barn that Erastus, her grandfather, had just built, and it's enormous. So it must have been his pride and joy. And it was big red barn, and he slapped a huge painting of a pagoda on it. I actually have a picture somewhere.
What you're talking about is the Huanghua Pagoda in China.
Shanghai. I'm sorry. Can you see that?
Yes. Yeah.
So somehow that ends up on the side of the barn. It's still there today, and it's enormous. And it's very odd to think that that is on the side of a barn in upstate New York, particularly when you think about the history of what was happening in America at that point. We're on the run up to the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, and there's already been a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric and politics and laws passed to restrict Chinese immigration to the United States. So the idea of them putting this pagoda on the barn is hard to read as anything other than a gesture of huge support to their new granddaughter. And almost, I think, anybody who's got a problem, bring it on. We're ready. They were proud of her because it's a very obvious symbol to have on the side of their barn. Now, that pagoda is the Luanghao Pagoda in Shanghai. And it's a very special place in Shanghai, and it is 900 years old. And it's supposed to be where the bones of the Buddha are, and the emperor protects it. And it was a place that had many festivals, including a special one in May where people would go for the peach festival. The pagoda used to be surrounded by an orchard of very heavy, sweet peaches, and apparently the smell would, radiate for miles. And if you went on that day of the festival, you could ask the dragons who guarded the pagoda for a wish. And that's where I started. What would a girl who was half Chinese, living in China, who perhaps did not know much about her father, wish for? So because we knew nothing about her mom and not that much about her father even, I had to make up a lot of things. So when you're writing historical fiction, the real trick is to come up with something that is credible, that fits with what you know, but lets you tell a good story. So in my mind, I had the trigger for the story really be that Ning, that's her name in China, is coming up on 12. And for a young lady, I made her mother a lady based on the fact that we had seen pictures of her where she's wearing, pretty fine clothing, that her mother would be looking for a husband, that this is a matchmaking age. Not that she would be married at 12, but the process would start. But a young lady at this point in time in China would almost certainly have had her feet bound. And there's some hints that her mother was from Suzhou, which is a city inland from Shanghai that was famous for its tiny, tiny women's feet. They called them lotus blossoms, where the women would totter on these feet. And anyone who knows anything about foot binding, it's brutal. So from an American perspective, I had to think about what her father might have thought about a daughter, however wanted or unwanted or known or unknown. Would he have wanted his daughter to be mutilated? And how strongly her mother might have felt about the necessary reasons to do that, that she couldn't be considered a young lady if she had plain natural feet. Now, I'm also coming from a perspective where my feet are size 11 and my mother's feet are not small and my aunt's feet are not small. So it's sort of a family joke that, big feet and foot binding do not go together. So I've meandered a little bit. I'm sorry about that. But I had her come to upstate New York and find that she may not have fit in China, but she also doesn't fit in here. And she has to make a decision about what she's looking for.
So this is a really important point that I want to talk about, but I also want to mention that to me, one of the things that you did that really added veracity to historical fiction, which of course is, has that nugget of truth. It is based on a family story, is that you do have some artifacts from Nina's father, George, right? And from, that you mention in the book. You place these items in the book. One is it a patent or a document relating to the dredge that he brings, right? From the...
Yeah. These are artifacts that I grew up with.
Right.
There is my mother. I remember when I was about 7, my mom went to visit, I think, her aunt or her great aunt. From my perspective, she was just very old. And I remember my mother, who was a professional photographer at the time, kneeling on the floor of a living room with a big camera and lights and taking pictures of this huge scroll that's all Chinese. And in the center is a dredge. And there's only a little bit of English on it that refers back to the Shanghai Merchants Association. But it's a very big piece. My mother's always had it hanging in her dining room. When I started to write the book, my mother just kept bringing out new things that I'd never seen before. One of which was a set of shoes that are about this small. And they've never been worn. They're clearly handmade. And it's like, that's interesting. Or another piece was a doll. The kind of doll that was handmade. It's a Chinese girl. And I'll tell you, I got shivers down my spine thinking about this doll being carried by a little girl on that long voyage from Shanghai to America,
Right.
And still surviving today.
Right.
It's very cool.
It is very cool. Yeah.
There's also a necklace that is made of jade and of see, it's red beads and jade, and my mother has it, and she got it from her mother. And going back to Nina, and every picture we have of Nina, she's wearing this necklace. There's a picture of her wedding where she's wearing a very high waist or a high necked collar, and you can see the necklace around her neck. My mother wore it at her wedding, her second wedding, and added a pendant. And someday it will be mine, and then someday I'll have to decide which of my daughters deserves it.
But what's interesting about that is that for me, it's very much like the work we try to do at the museum, right? How can an artifact, how can an object really bring a story to life and, you know, allow people a way to think more personally about the past, right? And what people did in their own time. So toward that end, you mentioned Nina, right? She had to change her name when she got here. Fitting in. So in the book, and of course you don't know a great deal about these details in her life. You know, obviously she married here and she had many descendants, but there is this question of how did she fit in? You know, we know that she didn't, or at least you write her as not fitting in China because she was completely Chinese, right? You mentioned she has green eyes, like your own, which I don't know if people can see that on the film, right, on the video, but so it's based on kind of historical research and social research, and the fact that China was, to your point, closed until the mid-19th century, until Westerners started to sort of get further and further into China to trade. It must have been very difficult for her. You know, historical and social research proves that out. But then again, same thing, not here. So I'm really interested in your perspective on this. I'm interested in your perspective on researching how she may have felt, because by your own admission, you and I always talk about this, you're an American, you're, you know, many generations removed from China and the Chinese experience, right? Or the immigrant experience. So how difficult was it to research that and get to that idea?
Well, and let's start in China. I love, if I can, to go to a place that I'm writing about. And I did get to Shanghai for a week about 3 or 4 years ago. And to my dismay, discovered that there is nothing of the 1870s left in Shanghai.
Except for the pagoda.
The pagoda is still there, although the pagoda did sustain a lot of damage in World War II.
Yeah.
But they rebuilt it. But it's a city that's growing so fast all the time that all those, unless it's a bona fide tourist destination like the old market, all that part of Shanghai is gone. I found a guide who I met through an English society that was all about preserving the history of Shanghai. They directed me to a young man who'd grown up there. And he brought me to places that dated from the era, but it was really scattershot. It was, you know, a place here and a place there and a place there, and there's the pagoda. So there wasn't a lot. I did better with the Museum of Shanghai because it had a lot of photographs from the 1890s, 1900 era. Of course, just as an aside, that museum was wild because you'd see all these, it was a lot of poverty and a lot of not very pleasant scenes. And the museum literally went, and then you would turn a corner and you'd go into the communist era and suddenly everything was better. So it was a funny museum from that perspective, that there was a definite political agenda just in the physical layout of the design. And they also had great dioramas. I mean, just these, you know, life size, you know, if you wanted to go to an apothecary shop, you could see, in fact, all those scenes, every diorama I saw, I used because it was so interesting. And I had pictures. It was one of the few ways I could see what life was like then. But I was trying to find what an American, half Chinese person would think in Shanghai at the time. You have to realize at this point in time, Shanghai is on the losing end of a big treaty that the British had dictated with gunboats. And the city has been divided up into international areas. So the biggest one is the British. The Americans have a big chunk. The French have a chunk. And the Chinese have literally been squashed into the original stone city. So they're very crammed. And it's considered the kind of place where the English will go for an adventure. They'll go into the old city to see what it's like. And that's where I place Nina, that she grew up there. But when she leaves the confines of the city, when she goes under these, huge thick walls, they're the original walls that safeguarded the city for hundreds of years, she's literally in a different world. She is on a big avenue that looks, like it could be in London. It's the Bund. And the buildings there are no Chinese buildings. There's only one, and it's the customs house. The rest of them are all banks and hotels, and it's for the British. It's still like that to a certain extent. If you go to the French Quarter of Shanghai, it feels like you're walking in Paris. It's the strangest thing I've ever seen. You'll turn a street, and even the poplar trees are the same as they are in Paris. So I thought about what it would be like to be someone who is being raised Chinese in that environment, knowing that the Westerners have the better chunk of the city, that there are parks along the water that she can't go into. They say no Chinese allowed. That would she want to be part of that group, or would she feel loyal to her mother's culture? And I don't think she really knows. And part of it is wrapped up in the conflict she has with her mother, because I think her mother, the way I wrote it, since I know, let me start with, the facts we know is that her mother seemed to be a lady. The photograph we have of her, she's wearing, beautiful clothes. Her feet are clearly bound. They're tiny, tiny, tiny. But she has this daughter. So, and I knew from my social research that she could not have taken a half American daughter back to her family. When her husband went back to America, if they were married, she could not have brought that child home. So she is effectively exiled in her own country because of this daughter. And I love playing with that kind of relationship with mothers. I did the same thing with my first book about Queen Victoria, when she's growing up with a mother who has big ambitions for her daughter that aren't about loving her, they're about using her. With Ning and Nina's mother, I think it might have been the opposite way, that maybe getting rid of her might have been a relief, that she could go back to a life that she was more familiar with. Particularly since if her daughter did not have bound feet, that she would be considered, they had a term for it that's very derogatory called a yellowfish, because they're flat. So she's got a daughter who's being, mocked, and will always be a symbol that she's lost something, that she doesn't fit in. So I think the mother doesn't fit in. I think Ning doesn't fit in. So what's the mom to do when the matchmaker says, this is a girl I can't find a husband for? She calls the father. And I think it made sense to me that the father might not even know about the daughter, that the father might show up and discover not only did he have a daughter, but she's 12, and the mother has made plans for Ning to go home with him, that Ning with the big feet can have maybe a proper life in America that she can't have in China. So it's lots of drama. It was fun to write.
Yeah, no, it was very dramatic. I mean, you spoke a lot about, so in the book she comes and, her grandfather is remarried. It's her grandfather and step grandmother. And her step grandmother in the book is very kind of at first resentful and worried about her social status, and, eventually comes around. Do you know, to the extent that that's what happened? Do you know about the nature of their relationship?
I know where it ended up.
Right.
It ended up with them being quite close.
Okay.
But when I looked at family trees that my mother and other women in the family had accumulated, when I saw that Sarah was a step-grandmother. So she's a step-grandmother suddenly saddled with a half-Chinese granddaughter. And we did know that she was very active in the best church, the fanciest, most expensive church to join, and that she'd helped to found a group called the Church Benevolent Society, which still exists. And at the time, it was actually it helped the indigent in town, which often were Native Americans and freed slaves. So she had a position to protect, and I could see very few ways that her first reaction would not be dismay.
Mm-hmm.
And that's hard on a little girl who's come so far. and particularly when Nina realizes, I really have made a mess for myself by having her name change. But when she grows up as Ning, which means peace in Chinese, but when her father finally takes responsibility for her, he gives her an American name so that it won't be quite so odd for her. But she's very resentful of that and doesn't want to be called Nina, and only does when she realizes that it might be the only way she can be accepted, that she doesn't want to be any more different than she already is. She accepts the name Nina. So I'll call her Nina from now on. But Nina is especially dismayed when she realizes that there isn't even a tie of blood between her and Sarah. She was sort of counting that ultimately, Sarah would have to come around because, she's related to me. And then she wasn't. So the relationship with Sarah, I found really fun to write, really interesting, and hard to do credibly that, she could somehow learn to respect the differences and embrace them, and bring Nina into her family. But we do know that they were very close. And after the husband died, after Erastus died and Nina married, Nina's husband left her for her seamstress with 9 children. And Sarah moved back into the house to help her raise them. So they end up close. So the fun part for me writing historical fiction was to create a situation where they started out very far from there and to bring them to where that ending is possible,
Okay.
which I really liked. I made the grandfather Erastus much more easygoing because he thinks it's fun. He's got a granddaughter he didn't expect, bonus. And he's quite charming with her and tries to give her advice. But when it comes right down to it, Sarah's the one who rules the house. Sarah's the one that she has to figure out how to get along with.
Now, do you know if George had other children? Did Nina have half siblings? Did she have cousins?
Not that we know of.
Right.
I think he was always traveling. I mean, we know he went back to China at least once, maybe twice, we're not sure. But he also ended up, there's a radio program through DuPont, it's telling the story of something that happens, I think, in 1910. And he's one of the characters.
Really?
And, a wildcat, the first oil rig that they found, the gusher, that then catches on fire or something. And he was there. So we know that he never stayed home. He didn't raise her in any way. So if there were other children, we don't know. But we do know, which I didn't find out till about halfway through the research. My mother casually said something about how, George just didn't seem that happy. Well, not surprisingly, he killed himself. And I'm like, Mom, what do you mean he killed himself? And she said, oh, yeah, he shot himself in Phoenix and left a letter for Nina, that all of his things should go back to her. And there was a suggestion that he'd been in chronic pain, which sort of gives him an excuse maybe for being sort of a jerk, but he's a jerk all the way through the book.
Right. Did your family ever think about going to, trying to research further into your Chinese family, like to follow son's lineage backwards?
I tried to find any kind of foothold for that, and we didn't really have anything. The only references we had to her name actually had her name as IUN, but someone had, the wife of my great-great-uncle, I think, had typed up some journals, and the original journals weren't available. I don't know what happened to them. And her typing wasn't fabulous. And when I showed native speakers the name that I thought I had, they're like, no, not really. That's not a name. So, but we decided Sun was. And the reference we saw something that was Sun Yotai or something like that. But in his journal, which we had, there's a reference to Futai, which is a famous family in Suzhou. So I ended up giving her a name that was more credible than the actual documentation I had, which was interesting. Right. Because the person who typed up that journal had no idea. But I haven't been able to find a record of her entering the country. So I had no way to trace her back. All I had was this photograph. Now, one of the things my mother thought at one point was that maybe she was some sort of courtesan and that she was given to my grandfather. It's a very romantic, sort of weird fantasy that my mom had. And I remember showing it to my guide in Shanghai. And he looked at me and said, She's not pretty enough to be a courtesan.
Oh,
But it was sort of a relief because it's very hard to write a story for middle graders that has a prostitute involved.
yeah, yeah.
So, it was easier to have her be someone who's a black sheep of the family for having fallen in love with an American.
And it also opens up discussions of exploitation, right? Americans, British, and French Europeans colonizing Shanghai were heavily involved in exploiting not just the resources but the people, right? So for her to be a courtesan would have
It would have taken another step. It would have to have been a young adult novel.
at that point, right? Exactly.
And I'll find that in historical fiction for kids, the more politics you have, the heavier and unwieldier it gets.
Right.
I find that you have to understand what's going on, and you have to let little hints come in.
Right.
And then you use your author's note to say, well, this is what's going on, and you might want to check out more, because there will be some kids who are interested in pulling at that thread, who want to know what was going on in China then, who will take these little references I've made to the international section and the no Chinese allowed, and say, I want to know more. And I give them a path, but otherwise it really weighs down the story.
Have you, tell us, if you will, about obviously this is Asian American Pacific Islander Month, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this book really, it opens up so many interesting questions about the United States' relationship with people of Asian descent and Asian heritage. And I'm interested to know what responses, if any, have you had from the AAPI community about this book?
Well, it only came out last month, so
Right.
I haven't had a lot of conversations about it. I have found the community is actually, right now, they're galvanizing across the board.
Okay.
There's lots of political groups, and there's a lot of kid-lit API groups that are raising money to help raise awareness, and they're very welcoming. I haven't gotten any sense like, you don't belong. But on the other hand, I'm being extremely tactful and not saying I'm Asian American and I have anything other than an academic sense of what kind of struggle you're going through right now. But personally, I was shocked to realize, I knew about the Anti-Chinese Exclusion Act. I did not realize it wasn't fully repealed until the 60s.
Yeah.
It should not have shocked me, but it did. And then the more I read about what was happening in California in the 1870s and 80s, it was just horrific.
Mm-hmm.
It was better on the East Coast just because the numbers weren't here,
Right.
But I did read several, there's a lot of reports of riots going on in New York City that were all about attacking Chinese people for working for less wages. And then it gets all wrapped up with the slaves and the Irish. And
yeah.
It's just so complicated. So I have been very careful to approach this as a writer, and it's my family story, and I want to be respectful of that. And it really worked for me narratively that she runs into prejudice.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's realistic. It's credible that she would have had kids make fun of her, that the school books at the time, if they wrote about China, were just full of xenophobic garbage, eating the rats and peeing on the streets. It was just ridiculous. They were not accurate. And so I had no problem thinking that kids would be pretty awful, that adults would give her a side eye, and that Sarah, her grandmother, might need to wade in and protect her.
Right.
But she also protects herself, which was fun to write. And I like creating that kind of role model, somebody who sits there and says, no, wait a minute, what you're saying is ignorant nonsense.
Right.
Maybe I don't know enough about America yet, but I can tell you what you're saying about where I came from is wrong.
It's very empowering for children, right? I think this is where we want children of all ethnicities and all identifications and all groups to feel empowered to speak and to state what feels important to them. This is something that, educators certainly speak to, and parents. And I think that that's what I really loved about this character. As young as she was, 12 years old, there was a point past which she just wasn't going to tolerate it anymore. You're not going to speak about my home country in this way.
Yeah, there comes a tipping point where it's like, either I give up everything that I loved and let you walk all over me, or not.
And always tempered with this ambivalence, because even in China, the way you write the character in China, she is also, she's an outsider. She does not get to avail herself of, you talked about her, like all Chinese, not being able to avail herself of, certain, the parks and the British section and certain, niceties. But as you wrote the character, her mother doesn't let her avail herself of life in the old city either, right? Because she's embarrassed of her. She doesn't want her to be made fun of, or she doesn't want to bring, trouble on their heads, right? So I love the complexity of this character as a young person. You wrote her in a very complex way, which I think will resonate for all children.
Well, my editor drove me a little crazy in this book. I rewrote it, as you know, from scratch several times. And my editor was not great at telling me what it needed to be, just that it wasn't yet.
No.
Which is a little frustrating. But one of the things that she did give me very clear feedback on is I had written her life in China at one point so negatively, without really meaning to, that my editor said, well, why wouldn't she want to leave? You've got to give us something. You've got to give us something where she loves this. So when I went back and wove in that kind of feeling that, there are things that are beautiful that she is noticing, particularly because she's not allowed to go out all the time, that when she is allowed to go out, she's noticing everything, and she's remembering everything, and she's feeling with every sense she's got. And the scene just before she gets on the boat, she's walking through her house, and it's just a flood of memories that she's storing up like acorns for the winter, that she can remember later. The persimmons on the table, the smell of hot, spicy oil, the incense in her living room. So that I was sad when she left Shanghai, when she's steaming away down the Huangpo River, that she's leaving something behind, something that she loves. And
never went back to China.
No, I think she had means. There's a picture of her as an old woman with like what's supposed to be one of the first Model T Fords in Baldwinsville. So she had money. I think she could have gone, but I think she chose to make her life here.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question that before we open it up to questions from the audience, or questions that Nicole may have, I'm going to ask you the question that you and I talk about privately all the time, as people who write historical fiction and are passionate about history. And it's this idea of who gets to write what, right? And it's the idea of, and my position on this, I always say it's a case-by-case basis. It depends on the story. It depends on how current it is, or there are living people who can tell it, and so on. I always think about this book because I do know that you're working on it for many, many years. We've talked about it over many, many years.
Again, I apologize. You suffered through this book too.
No, I did not suffer. It was very fascinating to me. This idea that on the one hand, it is your family story. So you're telling your family story. On the other hand, by what I always say, unabashedly I say, is our American desire to pinpoint people and put them in a box and check the check mark based on what we see with what we think we see with our own eyes versus what is potentially really there, right? There's always that fear of, are people going to say, well, I, Michaela MacColl, look a certain way. I don't look Chinese. I haven't been raised in a Chinese culture. I therefore I can't write about this, So I wonder if in the process of writing this particular book, have you kind of thought differently or evolved your ideas or how have your ideas sort of firmed up or changed, if at all, around inclusion in literature, inclusion in writing, particularly historical fiction? We're talking about history here, which, no matter what, in my opinion, even if it's your own family story, requires research like you did, right? You were not alive in 1870 in Shanghai or in America. Like
Yeah.
you have to do that research.
Well, it's interesting. I was earlier today, I was on a panel for School Library Journal, and the panel is called Finding Home. And the other people on the panel, two of them were refugees, one from Syria, one from Iraq. And the other one had been in Kosovo and was a third generation orphan.
Well,
I know it was, and then there was me, and I was talking about this fairy tale of a story I inherited, and that my book was really me trying to go back and put some meat on that story and make it more than just a story. And we all know the difference between a story and a novel. There's a big gap.
right.
So yeah, I struggled with, do I have the right to tell a story of a young Chinese girl? But she's my great-great-grandmother. And I went back and forth on it. But I ended up, I think, for me, it became about her character. And I really ended up liking her and feeling like I could speak for her. And that I am part of a continuum that she was part of, that we're connected, as we are. And that I had the right to tell that story. Now, I know that from a marketing perspective, my publisher would love for me to get involved with Asian voices and own voices, but I've been sort of holding back, saying I'm fine with it being a family story. I love that it's an immigration story. Like, everybody in America, except for the Native Americans, came from somewhere else. And we all face this question of who are we once we get here? So I like telling that story of someone who happens to come from China coping with the decision to become an American here or not. But what's interesting is that my family made a decision from that pagoda going on the barn in the 1870s to my mother's grandmother, so 2 generations down. They had become ashamed of being Chinese. They had decided not to tell that story about themselves.
Interesting.
And when my mother was, 10 or 11, that dreaded genealogy project that they do in middle school, my mother's mother sat her down and said, I have to fess up. We're actually a little Chinese. Now, my mother loved it, and I grew up thinking it was really cool too. And I've written a book about it. I'm fine. But I think each generation decides, how you tell that story and who has the right to tell it. So I'm comfortable with where I got to on the story. I'm happy to have told my family's story. I'm happy to have cast a light on the Asian immigration story. And I'm hoping that kids read this and they connect it to the news today.
Yes.
That, Asian people are being attacked on the street simply because they're Asian. And they say, wait a minute, that happened a long time ago too. Why aren't we better now? Why aren't we better than this?
Why haven't we evolved? Right.
Yeah.
Last question I have for you, really quick. The painting of the pagoda on the barn, I understand the people who own the house and the barn now are upkeeping this painting, right?
It's still there. I don't know if they're upkeeping it. It's a big barn. There's parts of it that are not doing well, so they're focusing on what they're going to fix first.
Right. So, okay, but it's lasted. And I wonder, given the family, like you said, generations of the family trying to hide this, had it at any point fallen into deep disrepair, or was it always kind of there? It was just a kind of a cool thing in the town, even without the story.
Yeah, I think it was one of those things, in Westport, that thing on the back of the Galt barn, down by, there's a big mural on the back of a barn. Anyway, off of Campo. I have actually never seen it, but apparently if you go down a little side road, there's a big mural on a barn.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I heard about this at the Historical Society.
How can I trespass and say, no, I'm kidding, I'm not going to trespass. But I'm like,
I'll try to pin it down and get back to you. But yeah, I don't know when the family didn't have the property anymore. But it's been kept up as an oddity in town. And the farm is called Pagoda Hill. That's where the title comes from. And now the family that I knew has actually sold the house. And the house half burned down like 2 years ago.
Oh dear.
But the barn is still there. And they've got an Instagram account called Pagoda Hill. And they're showing all the renovations of the house. Every once in a while, I stalk it religiously, hoping for a glimpse of the barn.
That's great.
Yeah, but all these things are so fragile. I mean, the house was made of stone and was half destroyed. That barn is deteriorating and it's made of wood. I think we're just lucky that it didn't go up.
Yeah, very, very, very much so. Michaela, I want to thank you so much. This was really wonderful to speak with you.
Thank you.
We could speak for hours. I know, Nicole, there's probably some questions for you, Michaela. So.
We do have a question. We have a question from Sarah, and also a very dear friend of the museum. So the rest of our audience can see it here now. She first says that she's been waiting for this book for years, and she's so pleased that it's finally here. Her question actually relates to something you were talking about, Michaela, of course, with some of the issues that we are having today with discrimination against Asian Americans. And she asks, right now, is it the right time for a story like this to come out? Do you feel that this book is going to find a special audience because of the current events that are happening in the US?
I really hope so. I mean, I think any immigration story could come out at any time and there'll be connections to be made. But right now the connections are so strong. I mean, yesterday, Congress passed a law, making it, more difficult to do hate crimes against Asians. So I'm really glad this is a kind of book that we could fold into curriculum. And I had the credentials for writing historical fiction that, it's not it doesn't glorify anything. It's just, it's a story, but it's a story that kids can make connections from. And all they have to do is look at the news. I mean, I hate looking at the news now. I thought it would get better after the election, but it seems to be getting worse. So I think it's the right time. And that's not lucky, that's unlucky.
If anyone else does have a question, we do encourage everyone to enter it into the comments box. We are happy to go through any of those that anyone might have. I do have a question, Michaela. I also have heard this story for some time and been excited to read it. I have not read it yet, so I'm very much looking forward to reading this story. And seeing all of the twists and turns in your narrative. And I wonder if you would tell us a little bit more about maybe your most favorite part of writing and researching this book, and then maybe also the most challenging part for you.
I think it's the same answer. It's Shanghai. It was an amazing city, and it's such a Western city. And one night we were walking to dinner and we're on these narrow little streets that have been, narrow for, 1,000 years. And all these mopeds zipped up behind us. And there were, drivers in black leather and models, very tall, beautiful models, like from a Benetton ad, every color person possible, got off in front of us. And they were all dressed in green. And it was a gin ad. It was a gin party at a club. And it was all so modern. They hopped off the bikes. They opened up they had little coolers in the back of the mopeds, and they started handing out drinks. And it's like, wow, this is the kind of thing you'd see in a city in New York, but it's happening here. But then you'd look down an alley and there would be an apothecary. There would be live chickens. And it was such a city of such dichotomy, but the old stuff's going away. It's being hidden, it's being pushed out. And it was very hard to find the history that I was looking for, but it was a really exciting place to be. And I was really glad that the pagoda has enough historical significance that the Chinese have maintained it and kept it. But now, instead of getting to it through a little barge in a marsh, you can take the subway and there's a mall around it. My mom tells a story that she didn't know what pagoda it was, but she had a photograph of my great-great-grandfather in front of it. And when she went to China about 25 years ago, she showed people the picture, like, do you have any idea where I could find this? And they laughed at her. It'd be like, asking where the Eiffel Tower was in Paris. There, it's right there. So that was the most challenging thing. And the language was impossible. And you can't go into a Chinese library. You can't say that you're doing research or being a journalist. They do not appreciate it. And I was warned about that. So I just talked to a lot of different people that I met in museums or that our guide introduced us to. But basically I was on my own, which is odd. Normally when you go to a place, you're looking for the local historical society or the local museum, and you're finding that person who knows everything, who just wants to tell you. And I didn't have that resource. So that was hard. However, there were a lot of people who wrote about Shanghai at the time. A lot of travel logs. In fact, the character Mrs. Grand, who escorts Nina on her journey from China to the United States, is based on a woman named Mrs. Archibald Little, who was the wife of he was an anthropologist studying the Chinese, and she traveled a lot with him and then went back to America where she wrote romance novels. So she seemed like a good character to sort of get a flavor for her language and her point of view. But otherwise, I didn't have access to the things I normally have. I'm sort of looking forward to going back to a story that's about, Victorian England or Dickinson's Amherst, someplace where there's lots of things that I can read.
Well, I would imagine it's also extremely difficult because the fact of the matter is that obviously the Cultural Revolution in China probably wiped out firsthand period accounts, primary resources in China. So what you're left with, which is still a paucity, right? It's not that much, are descriptions of China and China through the viewpoint of Westerners, right? So Mrs. Little wrote a travel log, but I, as objective as she may have been or thought she was, it's still not, right?
I mean, she feels pretty modern to me. It's interesting because I was amazed reading her journals, thinking, oh, well, she's really approaching this with as little judgment, I think, as possible for a woman of her era. I mean, she was a good character. And in fact, she's a good character for Ning, even though this little girl is resisting becoming Americanized. Mrs. Brand in the book is giving her some good advice. Really, it's going to be hard on your grandparents. You should try to fit in. You'll do much better if you wear proper clothes, if you pin up your hair.
Proper meaning American clothes.
Proper American girl, yes. Right. Not wearing pants, for one thing.
Right. I mean, right. And that was a really interesting thing for me, because I wondered, will children really understand the impact of that? How in this period of time, in the 1870s, women did not wear pants. Girls did not wear pants. And yet, of course, traditional Chinese clothing, a tunic and loose pants, this is what Ning was wearing. These were her clothes. And really how scandalizing that would have been when she arrived here. And,
it sort of feels a little trite, but how uncomfortable she would find American clothes.
Yeah.
So I foreshadowed that a little bit by having her make fun of, the Westerners that she sees in Shanghai, that they just look impossibly uncomfortable, tight in all the wrong places, and wearing colors that don't wash well. But what did I want to say? The other thing I want to say about Shanghai and the paucity of resources is not only have the Chinese eliminated a lot, but to the extent that research is being done and things are being written about that are accessible, it's all about the 20s in Shanghai.
Right.
It's all about this sort of roaring, gangster-filled, very sexy period. So the 1880s might as well not have existed.
Right. Well, and historically, in terms of just if you think about history and American naval history and the history of commerce, it was a very fraught period of time. As you said, the treaty which established European outpost was really a hostage situation, we're going to bomb the city unless you give in, more or less, right?
Yeah, I didn't get into it in the book, but there was a whole separate justice system for Westerners and the Chinese. Everything was for the Westerners.
Right. Which is not different from the story of the colonization of the Caribbean. It's not different from, the Atlantic trade. It's not different from the story of the colonization of South America. This is a repetitive story. I think that because now in our time, China is a superpower and we think of it in a certain way. This is, it's not as understood as it could be. And I do find in my own work that it is naval historians that understand this the best. In studying the creation of the American Navy and studying the whaling industry and studying the sea merchants, these are the individuals who actually understand the nuances of this history in that period of time in the greatest detail. Because that's
it's interesting though, because China is so big and Great Britain is trying to control it, but it's like trying to control an elephant with its eyebrows,
Right.
They're just on the edges at the ports.
Right.
So I think whatever they do is limited. Although I did discover, and I was very surprised, that foot binding is so prevalent when Nina's growing up. But by about the 1890s, 1900, it's almost disappeared.
Yeah.
And it disappeared, as far as I can tell, largely because of the Western influence.
I was going to ask you, there was a lot of missionary work in China, and I'm wondering to what extent, often practices that could be deemed sort of fall under medical missionary work, right? Because this is, it is essentially a deliberate breaking of the foot and deforming it, right, to create a certain shape.
Oh, it's even worse than that. And
it's
breaking it over and over and over again and forcing a child to walk on it as it breaks. I mean, it's terrible.
It is.
But you're right, it was the missionaries and the expatriates, especially, there weren't that many Western women, but as more came, they formed more social clubs, and this became one of their big issues.
Right.
So I found that the churches in upstate New York would have taken up collections to write pamphlets that would be distributed in China about foot binding. And then they discovered that their target audience, the mothers, did not read. What's a missionary to do? So they altered their approach to go after the fathers. And they talked to the fathers and they pointed out, it all became about child death, about how many of these girls did not survive. And within a generation, it changed.
Interesting.
It really was. It was fascinating. That if she'd been born 20 years later, it wouldn't have been an issue.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating.
We do have one more, maybe two more, that I want to get to quickly before we wrap up our program. We have a question from Lori, and she says first that she loved Ning's relationship with number one boy. She asks, do you think that such a relationship could have existed at that time?
I do. Number one boy was the family servant, and it sounds like very odd, like something out of a 40s TV show to call him number one boy. But in fact, the more superior servants worked for the British, and they were called number one boy, and they had literally the keys to the castle. They made everything possible for their foreign employers. So by having number one boy insist on calling himself that, he's putting on airs. But it seemed very likely to me that in a small household that's very reclusive and has to spend a lot of time with each other, that there would be sort of breaking down a little bit of the barriers between a servant and a daughter of the house. And it's also the male-female dynamic. There's this one guy in the house and he's the servant, and these two very strong-willed women are always, pushing and pulling at him. He was the funnest person to write, I have to admit. He was really very funny, and I enjoyed creating him and giving Ning someone to care about her. I mean, I think she comes to terms with her mother's sort of coldness. But she did have someone who would hug her, who loved her unconditionally, who lets her do stupid things because he can't quite say no to her. And then when she gets to America, I really wanted her to find that again. And by the end of the book, she's establishing that relationship with her grandfather. So I think thinking of Number One Boy not as a servant, but more as a doting relative who happens to cook a really mean lion's mane soup.
So those are all of the questions that we have this evening. We did have another comment from Sarah, who says that even within the research in the museum's archives in the Westport newspapers from this time period, there are several notices about captains heading out to China. There isn't much information about what goods were being shipped, but there is this mention even in Westport's history of this connection.
I
I have no idea.
I think, as Sarah can speak to this, I think one of the Sherwood triplets, there were 3 captains in the later, mid to late 19th century. They were triplets. They were of the Sherwood family. Yes, everyone, Sherwood Island, those people. And I think one of them was on the China trade, if I recall. And I could be wrong. Yeah, I believe so.
May have been. Well, I don't want to keep everyone too long. So I do want to thank you, of course, Michaela, for sharing this wonderful story, sharing your family's story with us. It's fascinating. I'm so looking forward to reading the book.
Well, you've suffered through me talking about it a lot, so I hope you enjoy it. Thank you for having me.
Not a sufferer at all. I'm very excited. We do want to encourage everyone to pick up a copy of View from Pagoda Hill. We encourage you to shop on bookshop.org to support independent booksellers. You can, of course, pick it up at any of the major retailers as well. So thank you again, Michaela, and thank you, Ramin, for being here for these wonderful questions as well. And thank you, last of all, to our audience and for joining us. Thank you so much.
Have a good night. Thanks.
Thank you.